Welcome to Clandestine Cases. The village of St. Mary Mead had always been a quiet place, a sanctuary of hedgerows, gossip, and proper English sensibilities. But on a cold October morning, something shattered that peace. It began at the grand estate of Colonel Arthur Warburton, a retired military officer whose wealth and influence kept him comfortably ensconced in his ivy-draped mansion, known simply as Warburton Hall. The housekeeper, Mrs. Ferris, discovered him lying in his study, a pool of blood seeping into the Turkish rug beneath him. His throat had been slit with an alarming precision, clean, methodical, as though performed by a skilled hand. The study door was locked from the inside. The windows, too, were latched securely, their frames undisturbed. There was no weapon in sight, no sign of a struggle. And yet the colonel was undeniably dead. The only thing even remotely out of place was an incongruous object on his desk, a crumpled theatre ticket issued from a playhouse in London for a performance that had taken place 3 nights prior. Detective Inspector Cray of the local constabulary arrived first, his manner brisk but sceptical. "Locked room murder," he muttered, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Nothing ever quite as impossible as it seems." But as he surveyed the study, unmarred by forced entry with no hidden passages or secret latches, his confidence began to waver. The colonel had been a man of habit, seldom leaving his estate. What was he doing with a ticket from a London theatre? And more curiously, why was it clutched in his hand as though it mattered more in death than it had in life? Cray turned to the housekeeper. "Did Colonel Warburton have any visitors yesterday?" Mrs. Ferris, a stout woman with a face worn by years of service, hesitated. "Only Miss Rachel Hunter, sir. She's the young lady who moved into the village 6 months ago. A quiet girl, polite but always seemed a little anxious." "Anxious in what way?" Mrs. Ferris pursed her lips. "Well, she asked a lot of questions about the colonel, seemed rather keen to know about his past. And last night, when she left, she looked troubled." Rachel Hunter was found in her small rented cottage at the edge of the village. She was pale when Cray arrived, her hands trembling as she prepared tea. "I had nothing to do with his death," she insisted. "I only went to speak with him." "About—" She hesitated. "About what, Miss Hunter?" She swallowed. "I believe he was involved in something terrible." Cray leaned forward. "Explain." Rachel hesitated again, as though weighing whether to speak. But before she could answer, the door opened and a figure stepped inside. Miss Jane Marple. The elderly spinster, clad in a tweed coat and a sensible hat, had come unannounced, her blue eyes filled with quiet intelligence. "Oh dear," she said gently, glancing at Rachel's shaken expression. "I do hope I'm not interrupting." Cray sighed. "Miss Marple, I don't recall asking for your assistance." She smiled pleasantly. "No, of course not. But dear, Mrs. Ferris was kind enough to send word, and I do have some experience with puzzles." Rachel's gaze flickered between them, her fingers tightening around her teacup. Miss Marple turned to her with grandmotherly concern. "My dear, you said Colonel Warburton was involved in something terrible. Would you be so kind as to tell us what you meant?" Rachel took a shaky breath. "I think he was part of something during the war, something he didn't want anyone to know. I started looking into his past, and I found that he had connections to a man who disappeared years ago. A man named Geoffrey Layton." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but there was a sharpness in her gaze. Cray frowned. "Who's Geoffrey Layton?" Rachel hesitated. A playwright. He vanished in 1942, right in the middle of a successful run in London. Some say he defected. Others say he was killed. And you think Warburton was involved? I know. He was, Rachel said firmly. I found letters. Old letters, hidden in a second-hand book I bought at an antique shop in London. They were addressed to Warburton, warning him to stay silent. Prey rubbed his chin. And this theatre ticket? What does it mean? Rachel shook her head. I don't know, but I think someone wanted him dead before he could speak. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Oh dear. That does make things rather complicated, doesn't it? A silence stretched between them. Then Miss Marple gently set down her cup. I should like to see those letters, Miss Hunter, if you wouldn't mind. Miss Marple's request seemed to startle Rachel Hunter. The young woman hesitated, then slowly nodded. She rose from her chair, crossing the small sitting room to a wooden writing desk. From a locked drawer, she withdrew a bundle of yellowed letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Her hands trembled as she passed them to Miss Marple, who accepted them with a polite murmur of thanks. Detective Inspector Cray, standing with his arms crossed, watched impatiently. Miss Marple, this may be interesting, but we still don't have a murder suspect. Miss Marple untied the ribbon and leafed through the letters, her expression unreadable. Oh, but we do, Inspector, she said mildly. We just don't know which one yet. Cray frowned, but she continued before he could respond. These letters are quite revealing. Look here. This one dated September 1942. A play can be rewritten. A life cannot. Keep your silence, Arthur, or we shall all pay the price. And another, written a month later. Geoffrey's words are dangerous, and you know what happened to him. Don't make the same mistake. She tapped the brittle paper thoughtfully. Colonel Warburton clearly carried a secret from the war, one tied to this missing playwright. And someone still considered that secret worth killing for. Cray leaned over her shoulder. It doesn't tell us who, though. It could be anyone connected to Warburton's past. Perhaps, Miss Marple conceded. She carefully folded the letters and handed them back to Rachel. But I do wonder about that theatre ticket. Rachel swallowed hard. I wish I knew. But I swear, Colonel Warburton had it with him when I arrived last night. He mentioned it, said something about finally getting answers. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Did he now? Rachel nodded. I asked him what he meant, but he wouldn't say. Just muttered something about how he'd been a fool to think he was safe. A faint crease formed between Miss Marple's brows. Dear me, that does make one wonder, doesn't it? Cray exhaled sharply. Miss Marple, we need more than wonderings. If you have a theory, I'd like to hear it. Miss Marple smiled gently. Oh, I never theorize too soon, Inspector. But I do believe it would be wise to examine Warburton Hall once more. Cray, despite himself, agreed. They departed Rachel's cottage, leaving her pale and shaken, and made their way back to the grand estate. The housekeeper, Mrs. Ferris, admitted them with an air of barely restrained nerves. Inside the study, the body had been removed, but the crime scene remained undisturbed. Miss Marple moved with quiet purpose, her eyes taking in everything. The bookshelves lined with military histories, the neat row of pens on the desk, the dark stain on the rug. But it was not the obvious details that drew her attention. Instead, she stepped to the side of the room, where a small side table stood near the fireplace. There, sitting almost too neatly, was a glass tumbler. Miss Marple picked it up, tilting it toward the light. How very interesting. Cray frowned. What is? This glass, she said, turning it thoughtfully. You see, Inspector, the Colonel was a precise man. His study was orderly. Nothing out of place. But look here. There's a faint smear on the rim. Lipstick, I should say. And yet Mrs. Ferris assures me he had no visitors except Miss Hunter. And Rachel does not wear lipstick. Cray's expression darkened. So someone else was here. Miss Marple placed the glass back down precisely where she had found it. It would seem so. And someone with a rather particular habit. Notice how the glass was set aside as if meant to be forgotten, but not wiped clean. Cray turned sharply to Mrs. Ferris. Did you see anyone else enter last night? Mrs. Ferris looked startled. No, sir, just Miss Hunter. But I suppose if someone came in after I retired to bed, I wouldn't have known. The Colonel often stayed up late. Miss Marple gave a thoughtful hum. Then she stepped to the desk and traced a finger lightly over the scattered papers. This letter here, Inspector. Look at the date. Cray leaned in. October 3rd. Miss Marple nodded. The day before the murder. And it's from a solicitor in London. She read aloud. Regarding the inquiry into Geoffrey Layton's estate, further documents have surfaced that may shed new light on his disappearance. A meeting has been arranged to discuss this matter in confidence. Please bring any relevant correspondence. Cray straightened. So Warburton was about to meet someone who knew more about Layton. Maybe even someone from his past. Miss Marple tapped a finger against her chin. Indeed. And if Colonel Warburton was willing to break his silence, someone else might have had reason to stop him. Cray turned sharply to Mrs. Ferris. Did Warburton leave the house yesterday? The housekeeper shook her head. Not that I know of, sir. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Then someone brought the theatre ticket to him, which means they wanted him to see it. A silence settled over the room. Cray exhaled. We need to find out who visited him last. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Oh, I suspect the answer is quite close at hand. We need only to ask the right person. Detective Inspector Cray wasted no time, with Colonel Warburton's locked study yielding more questions than answers. He turned his attention to those who might have visited the old soldier before his death. And so, one by one, the voices of St. Mary Mead began to shape a picture, fragmented, contradictory, and laced with deception. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the drawing-room, listened carefully as the interviews unfolded. She had always believed that people revealed themselves not just in what they said, but in how they said it. The first to be questioned was Mrs. Ferris. The housekeeper twisted the hem of her apron as she spoke. I heard nothing unusual, sir. Truly I didn't. She insisted. Miss Hunter left around 8:30. The Colonel was alive then, I'm sure of it. Cray studied her. And you're certain no one else came in? Mrs. Ferris hesitated, then frowned. I can't say for sure. I retire early, you see, and with the Colonel's study door closed, well, I wouldn't have heard if someone slipped in. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. And in the morning, when you found him, was anything out of place? Mrs. Ferris chewed her lip. No. Well, yes. The decanter of brandy, sir. It had been moved. The Colonel always left it on the sideboard, but this morning it was on the desk. And the glass? He never left his glass out like that. Cray and Miss Marple exchanged a glance. Was the glass full? Miss Marple inquired gently. Mrs. Ferris frowned. No, nearly empty. Cray straightened. Then it's possible our killer poured him a drink before the murder. Miss Marple nodded. Or perhaps the Colonel poured one for someone he trusted. The second witness, Mr. Leonard Price, the Colonel's solicitor, arrived at the estate shortly thereafter. A thin, meticulous man with wire-rimmed glasses, he adjusted his cuffs nervously as he was ushered into the room. "I was to meet the Colonel this morning," he admitted. "He wrote to me about a matter regarding Geoffrey Layton's estate. Said he had information that could alter the entire case. It's quite distressing to think he was killed before we could speak." Cray narrowed his eyes. "What kind of information?" Price cleared his throat. "He didn't say in his letter, only that it was urgent." Miss Marple, who had been watching him with quiet attentiveness, spoke softly. "Mr. Price, are you quite sure you weren't in the Colonel's company last night?" The solicitor blinked. "Me? No, certainly not. I was in London until this morning." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And yet, you're quite nervous, aren't you?" Price flushed. "A man has been murdered, madam. I think a little nervousness is to be expected." Cray, unimpressed, made a note in his ledger. "Where were you last night?" "I told you, in London." Cray glanced up. "And can anyone confirm that?" Price hesitated. Well, no, I was alone." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "How unfortunate. But never mind. I expect the truth will emerge in time." The next to be questioned was Miss Rachel Hunter. She arrived looking weary, her hands clenched in her lap. "I told you everything I know," she said. "I went to see him. We spoke about Geoffrey Layton, and then I left. He was alive when I walked out that door." Cray studied her. "Did he seem afraid?" Rachel hesitated. "Not afraid exactly, but uneasy. He kept checking the time as if expecting someone, and before I left he told me, 'The past never stays buried.'" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "That's a curious thing to say. Did you ask him what he meant?" Rachel nodded. "He just shook his head and said I should leave it. Alone." Cray tapped his pen against his notebook. "And you're sure no one else arrived while you were there?" Rachel opened her mouth, then paused. Her brows knitted together. "Well, I did hear something as I left. Footsteps on the gravel. But I didn't see anyone." Cray sat up. "Which direction?" Rachel frowned, thinking. "Near the back garden. Whoever it was, they weren't using the front drive." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her fingers stilled over her knitting. "That would suggest someone who didn't wish to be seen, wouldn't it?" Rachel swallowed. "I suppose so." Cray closed his notebook. "That's enough. For now, Miss Hunter. Don't leave the village." As Rachel departed, Miss Marple turned her attention back to Cray. "Inspector, I believe we should have a word with Miss Diana Barrow." Cray blinked. "The actress?" Miss Marple nodded. "She was once quite well known, but after the war her career faltered, and as it happens she was once very close to Geoffrey Layton." Cray frowned. "How do you know that?" Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, just an old memory. Theatrical gossip from years past. I expect Miss Barrow might have something to say about our mysterious theatre ticket." It took some time to summon Diana Barrow, but when she finally arrived, she did so with an air of irritation. A striking woman in her late 50s, her once glamorous features had hardened with age, but her presence remained commanding. "This is absurd," she said, flicking ash from her cigarette. "I barely knew the Colonel." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "But you knew Geoffrey Layton quite well, did you not?" Diana's lips tightened. "That was a long time ago." Cray leaned forward. "Do you know anything about this?" He placed the crumpled theatre ticket on the table before her. For a split second, Diana's expression flickered, surprise, quickly masked by indifference. "Where did you get that?" "It was found in Colonel Warburton's study, Miss," Marple said gently. "Why would he have it?" Diana exhaled slowly. "Because I sent it to him." Cray's eyes narrowed. "Why?" Diana tapped her cigarette against the ashtray. "Because I wanted to remind him of something." Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "Or warn him." A silence stretched between them. Then at last Diana spoke. "Fine, yes. I warned him. I told him the past was catching up with him." Cray's grip on his notebook tightened. "What past?" Diana's gaze darkened. "The war changed people, Inspector. Some of us made mistakes. Others profited from them." Miss Marple nodded. "And you feared that someone had come back for justice?" Diana's lips curled in a bitter smile. "Justice? No, Miss Marple, vengeance." Miss Marple studied Diana Barrow carefully, her sharp blue eyes missing nothing. The actress might have feigned indifference, but the tight grip on her cigarette holder and the tension in her jaw spoke volumes. Inspector Cray, less inclined to subtlety, leaned forward with an impatient frown. "Vengeance for what, Miss Barrow?" he demanded. Diana sighed, flicking her cigarette against the ashtray. "The war," she said simply. "It ruined some people and elevated others. Geoffrey Layton was a playwright, yes, but he was also a patriot. And that got him killed. The Colonel was part of that, whether he admitted it or not." Cray glanced at Miss Marple, but she remained silent, letting Diana continue. "Layton was writing something dangerous," Diana said. "He knew about people in high places, people who had made deals, compromises. It wasn't just about the war. It was about what happened after. Some men profited from the chaos. Some betrayed their own." Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "And you believe Colonel Warburton was one of them?" Diana exhaled slowly. "I don't believe I know." Cray tapped his pen against his notebook. "You sent the theatre ticket to him as a warning. But did you see him last night?" Diana hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I wanted to, but I lost my nerve. I thought maybe the sight of that ticket would be enough to make him confess." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Confess to whom, my dear?" Diana pressed her lips together. "Geoffrey's brother." Cray stiffened. "Layton had a brother." Diana nodded. "Charles Layton. He disappeared after the war, went to Canada, I think. But he came back, and he was looking for answers. He wanted justice for Geoffrey." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Cray. "And where is Charles now?" Diana lifted her chin. "I don't know. But if anyone had a reason to kill the Colonel, it was him." Cray snapped his notebook shut. "We'll find out soon enough." As Diana was dismissed, Miss Marple remained deep in thought. The puzzle was forming, but the pieces refused to fit neatly. Diana had her motives, certainly, so did Rachel. Hunter, with her connection to the lost manuscript, and Leonard Price, who seemed far too nervous for a man with nothing to hide. And now Charles Layton entered the picture, a man returning from exile seeking justice. They reconvened in the Colonel's study, where Cray instructed a constable to make inquiries about Charles Layton. Miss Marple meanwhile traced her, fingers lightly over the decanter of brandy, her expression unreadable. "Inspector," she said suddenly, "I wonder, was there anything missing from the Colonel's study?" Cray frowned. "Not that we could tell." "Why?" Miss Marple nodded toward the desk. "I rather think there was something here. A document, perhaps. Something the Colonel intended to bring to his meeting with Mr. Price this morning." Cray's gaze darkened. "You think the killer took it?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Well, that depends, Inspector. Did they kill to take it? Or to stop it from ever being seen?" Before Cray could respond, a constable entered, his face serious. "Sir, we've found Charles Layton. He arrived in the village 2 days ago, staying at the Red Lion Inn." Cray nodded, briskly. "Bring him in." Minutes later, Charles Layton entered the room, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, his face weathered by years abroad. His eyes flicked between Cray and Miss Marple with quiet calculation. "I suppose this is about Warburton," he said without preamble. Cray studied him. "You were seen asking about him in the village. You sent word to his solicitor. And now he's dead. That's a lot of coincidence." Layton met his gaze without flinching. "I won't deny I wanted answers. Warburton knew what happened to my brother. He knew the truth. But he let Geoffrey's name be erased." Miss Marple spoke gently. "And did you go to see him last night?" Layton hesitated. "Yes. But he wouldn't see me. Told Mrs. Ferris to send me away." Cray frowned. "And you left?" Layton nodded. "I waited outside for a while, hoping he'd change his mind. Then I saw someone else arrive. A woman." Cray's jaw tightened. "Describe her." Layton rubbed his chin. "Difficult to say in the dark. But she wore a dark coat, moved quickly. She wasn't there long, 5 minutes maybe." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet understanding. "Inspector," she said, "do you recall Mrs. Ferris mentioning that the brandy decanter had been moved?" Cray frowned. "Yes, what of it?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "I rather think the Colonel was poisoned before he was shot." Cray stiffened. "Poisoned?" Miss Marple nodded. "Oh, yes. The glass had lipstick on it, you recall. A woman gave him that drink, and if Mr. Layton's account is accurate, she wasn't there long enough for an argument. She had only enough time to hand him a drink, say a few words, and leave." Cray's mind raced. So the gunshot was staged, to make it look like an obvious murder, instead of a carefully planned one. Miss Marple smiled. "Indeed, and I suspect the real motive lies in whatever the Colonel was about to reveal." Cray exhaled. "Then we need to find that missing document." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, I expect it's closer than you think." "Inspector." Cray felt the case snapping into place. The motive was clear. Colonel Warburton had known something dangerous, something connected to Geoffrey Layton's mysterious death during the war. The suspects had come into focus, and now, with Charles Layton confirming that a woman had visited the Colonel just before his death, the investigation had a new urgency. Cray's men worked quickly, questioning the staff at the Red Lion Inn. It wasn't long before a young barmaid, eager to be helpful, provided a new lead. "Miss Hunter," she said, eyes wide with the excitement of scandal. "She was here last night, sir, not long before the Colonel was murdered. Left in a dreadful hurry, she did." Miss Marple, seated nearby with her knitting resting in her lap, glanced up. "In a hurry, you say? How very interesting." Cray wasted no time. Rachel Hunter was brought in again, this time looking more shaken than before. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat before them, her eyes darting between Cray and Miss Marple. "I already told you everything," she said. Cray folded his arms. "Did you? Because we now know you were at the Red Lion last night." "You didn't mention that before." Rachel swallowed. I didn't think it was important." Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. "But it is, my dear. Because we also know that a woman visited Colonel Warburton shortly before he died. A woman who left very quickly." Rachel's face paled. "You think that was me?" Cray leaned forward. "Was it?" Rachel hesitated. Her fingers twisted the edge of her scarf, her breath uneven. Then, with a shaky exhale, she nodded. "Yes, it was me." Cray's expression hardened. "And what did you do while you were there?" Rachel licked her lips. I gave him a drink." Silence stretched between them. Cray let out a slow breath. "The brandy." Rachel nodded miserably. "He poured it himself. I just wanted to talk to him. I wanted answers." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And did you get any?" Rachel shook her head. "No. He wouldn't tell me anything. He just kept saying that some things were better left buried." Cray stood abruptly. "Rachel Hunter, I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Colonel Warburton." Rachel's eyes widened in horror. "No, I didn't kill him." Cray signaled to a constable who stepped forward. "We'll see what the judge thinks." As Rachel was led away, Cray turned to Miss Marple with satisfaction. "That's that, then. She admitted to being there. We know the brandy was tampered with. It's an open and shut case." Miss Marple, however, merely smiled her gentle, knowing smile. "Oh, I do admire a quick resolution, Inspector. But you see, something still doesn't fit." Cray frowned. "What doesn't fit?" "We've got her at the scene, we've got the poisoned brandy." Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against her armrest. "And yet we also have a gunshot." Cray hesitated. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "If Rachel Hunter poisoned him, why shoot him afterward? It makes no sense, unless the gunshot was meant to cover something up. And then, of course, there's the missing document." Cray exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Are you saying she's innocent?" Miss Marple smiled. "I am saying that I rather think we haven't quite solved this yet." Cray muttered something under his breath. But Miss Marple simply reached for her knitting, watching as Rachel Hunter was taken away. Outside, the sky had darkened. The storm that had threatened all day finally broke, sending sheets of rain against the windows. Somewhere, hidden in the shadows, the real killer was waiting. The rain lashed against the windows of Colonel Warburton's house, the storm deepening the heavy atmosphere inside. Miss Marple sat quietly in the study, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. Inspector Cray, still unsettled by her lingering doubts, paced near the fireplace, watching the flickering shadows cast by the flames. "We've got her at the scene," he muttered as though convincing himself. "She admitted to giving him the brandy." Miss Marple looked up, her expression mild. "Yes, dear. But the problem remains. If Rachel Hunter had poisoned him, why was he shot?" Cray let out a slow breath. "Maybe the poison wasn't acting fast enough." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Poisoners do not typically bring firearms, Inspector. It rather defeats the purpose." Cray sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. "Then who, Miss Marple? Who else had cause?" She gave him a small, thoughtful smile. "I rather think the past holds the answer." Cray frowned. "The past?" Miss Marple leaned forward. tapping her fingers lightly on the polished wooden desk. Geoffrey Layton. His death was never fully explained, was it? The Colonel knew something about it. Something dangerous enough that someone silenced him before he could reveal it. And then there's that missing document, which must have been important enough to kill for. Cray's frown deepened. You think this is all tied back to Layton's death? Miss Marple nodded. I do. And I suspect we've been looking at this the wrong way round. This was never about the Colonel, not truly. It was about what he knew. A sudden knock at the door interrupted them. A constable entered, his coat dripping from the storm. Message from the station, sir. We found the missing document. Cray straightened. Where? The constable hesitated. It was in Mr. Price's office, sir, hidden in a stack of old ledgers. Cray exchanged a glance with Miss Marple before snatching up his coat. Come on, let's see what this is about. They arrived at Leonard Price's office to find the solicitor looking pale and anxious, wringing his hands as the rain drummed against the windows. A single sheet of paper lay on his desk, smoothed out carefully. I don't know how it got there, Price insisted as Cray loomed over him. I didn't take it. Cray ignored him and turned his attention to the document. It was old, yellowed at the edges, written in a precise military hand. As his eyes scanned the text, his expression hardened. Miss Marple read over his shoulder, her voice soft. It's an official report, a wartime tribunal. Cray's jaw clenched. Geoffrey Layton wasn't just killed. He was executed. A silence settled in the room. Price swallowed audibly. I had no idea. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with understanding. Executed for treason, she murmured. Cray exhaled sharply. But it doesn't make sense. Geoffrey Layton was a playwright, not a soldier. Why would he be involved in treason? Miss Marple's fingers trailed lightly over the paper. Because, my dear Inspector, I rather think he wasn't guilty at all. Cray turned to her, startled. Then why was he executed? Miss Marple gave him a knowing look. Because someone wanted him out of the way. Cray's mind worked rapidly. And Colonel Warburton knew the truth. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, and someone killed him before he could reveal it. Price, still visibly shaken, cleared his throat. Inspector, I swear, I didn't know about this. Cray studied him. Then how did this document end up in your office? Price hesitated. I don't know. Someone must have placed it there. Miss Marple's gaze was thoughtful. Or perhaps, Mr. Price, you knew more than you realized. You handled the Colonel's affairs after all. Is it possible you came across something, a reference to this tribunal perhaps, and simply didn't understand its significance? Price paled further. Perhaps. There were papers he asked me to look into, military files he wanted access to. But I never thought. He swallowed hard. You don't think the Colonel was planning to expose this, do you? Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. Oh, I think that's exactly what he was planning. Cray turned to his constable. Find out who else knew about this document. We need to question them immediately. As the constable hurried out, Miss Marple's voice was quiet but certain. We are very close now, Inspector. The truth has been buried for a long time, but the past always has a way of revealing itself. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the walls of deception were beginning to crack. The storm had begun to subside, leaving a damp hush over the village. Inside Leonard Price's office, the air remained thick with tension. Inspector Cray ran a hand over the old tribunal document. once more his jaw tightening. Whoever wanted this buried killed Colonel Warburton to keep it that way, he muttered, and they were willing to frame Rachel Hunter to do it. Miss Marple, seated near the fireplace, appeared deep in thought. Her knitting lay untouched in her lap, and her sharp blue eyes flicked between Price and the document. "There's something curious about all this, Inspector," she mused. "You see, most deceptions have a certain neatness about them, an effort to make things appear logical even when they are not. But this is rather untidy." Cray frowned. "Untidy?" Miss Marple nodded. "The poisoned brandy, the gunshot, the missing document conveniently turning up in Mr. Price's office, it's all rather excessive, isn't it? Almost as if the murderer was trying too hard to misdirect us." Price, still pale, cleared his throat. "If I may, Miss Marple, you seem to believe that I've been used in some way." "Oh, I do," she said cheerfully. "But I think it was quite subtle someone planted that document knowing it would eventually be found." "But why?" Cray exhaled sharply. "It's a warning, a message to anyone else who might know the truth." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Precisely, Inspector. But there's something else troubling me." She turned to Price. "Mr. Price, forgive me for being forward, but did you ever discuss Colonel Warburton's concerns with anyone outside your office?" Price hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I wouldn't have spoken about confidential matters." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "No, I don't believe you would have. But tell me, do you keep a ledger of visitors?" Price blinked. "Yes, of course. Would you mind terribly if we had a look?" The solicitor hesitated, then retrieved a large leather-bound book. He flipped through the pages until he reached the week of the murder. Cray leaned over his shoulder. "Let's see. Rachel Hunter was here. Charles Layton as well." His finger moved further down the list. "Ah, and—" He stopped, glancing at Miss Marple. Her smile was knowing. "How very interesting, Inspector. Mr. Arthur Fanshawe." Price frowned. "Fanshawe? But why would he—" Cray snapped his fingers. "Of course. Fanshawe served with Warburton during the war. And wasn't he the one who first mentioned Warburton's paranoia?" Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "Yes, indeed. And now we find he visited Mr. Price not long before the murder. How very telling." Cray turned on Price. "Did he ask about any of Warburton's papers?" Price thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Now that you mention it, yes. He inquired about whether the Colonel had made any amendments to his will. I didn't think much of it at the time." Miss Marple gave a pleased nod. "That was rather clever of him. He was feeling for loose threads, you see. Testing to see if Warburton had left anything behind that might expose the truth." Cray straightened. "Then we bring Fanshawe in." Miss Marple pursed her lips. "I rather think we should do something more subtle, Inspector." Cray crossed his arms. "What do you have in mind?" Her smile was mischievous. "A small test of character, my dear. If we handle this properly, Mr. Fanshawe may very well expose himself." An hour later, under the dim glow of the village pub's lanterns, Miss Marple sat quietly at a table, while Cray and Fanshawe nursed their drinks. Nearby, the former officer was speaking in a low, steady voice. "Warburton always was a difficult man," Fanshawe said. "Kept too many secrets. I wouldn't be surprised if he brought this trouble on himself." Cray sipped his drink, nodding along. "Still, the tribunal document we found, quite the revelation, wouldn't you say?" Fanshawe's expression barely flickered. But Miss Marple caught it, the briefest tightening of his jaw, the faintest flicker of his eyes toward the door. "Yes, quite," he said smoothly. "Though I suppose it's best left buried. No sense stirring up the past." Cray set his glass down. "Funny thing about buried secrets, though. They have a way of surfacing." Miss Marple chose that moment to drop her knitting needles with a small, startled gasp. Fanshawe turned, instinctively glancing toward the sound. And Miss Marple watched his reaction keenly. She retrieved the needles with a pleasant smile. "Oh dear, how clumsy of me. It's just that something struck me, you see. Colonel Warburton's brandy glass. It had fingerprints on it, didn't it, Cray? Picked up on her cue, yes, and we'll have the result soon enough." Fanshawe's hand clenched slightly on his glass. "I imagine they'll find Rachel Hunter's prints all over it." Miss Marple beamed. "Oh, I expect so. But the fascinating thing about brandy glasses, Mr. Fanshawe, is that they also reveal something else." He hesitated. "What's that?" Her voice was gentle. "Who wiped them clean first?" A muscle in Fanshawe's cheek twitched. It was almost imperceptible. But Miss Marple saw it. Cray, now fully alert, leaned forward. "That's the trouble with trying to be too careful, isn't it?" he said casually. "You make mistakes. Like poisoning a drink, wiping it down, and then forgetting that your own fingerprints should have been there to begin with." Fanshawe's face had gone rigid. Miss Marple sighed, shaking her head. "I imagine you were very thorough, Mr. Fanshawe. But you see, you didn't count on one thing. Colonel Warburton was an old man, wasn't he? The kind of man who probably had a habit of swirling his brandy before drinking it." Cray nodded grimly. "Which means even if you wiped the glass first, he would have left fresh fingerprints when he picked it up again. But if the glass comes back with no prints at all," Miss Marple finished for him, her tone almost regretful, "then we know someone else handled it after he collapsed." Fanshawe's breathing had quickened. His fingers twitched toward his coat. Cray was faster. "Don't even think about it," he snapped, his hand already on his revolver. Fanshawe froze. Then, with a defeated exhale, he slumped back into his chair. "Damn you," he muttered. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. "Oh dear," she murmured. "I do believe we have our man." The quiet of the village night seemed almost deceptive, as though the world had momentarily settled while beneath the surface, danger still lurked. Inspector Cray tightened his grip on Arthur Fanshawe's arm as they left the pub. The former officer's face a mask of bitter resignation. The rain had eased to a steady drizzle, misting the cobbled streets as they walked toward the station. Miss Marple followed at a measured pace, her knitting tucked neatly under her arm. Her mind, however, was far from tranquil. The pieces were fitting together, but something still tugged at the edges of her thoughts, an unease that hadn't quite lifted even with Fanshawe's arrest. At the station, Fanshawe was locked in a holding cell while Cray prepared the necessary paperwork. A constable had already been sent to retrieve the tribunal document from Price's office to add to the growing body of evidence. Miss Marple sat near the inspector's desk, watching the storm-laden sky through the window. "I do hope," she said after a pause, "that the document was well secured." Cray glanced up from his notes. "It was with Price in his office. Should be safe enough." Miss Marple didn't look convinced. "I would be much reassured if we had it in our hands, Inspector. After all, it is the only tangible proof we have of Colonel Warburton's knowledge and the motive behind his murder." Cray frowned, and, after a moment's hesitation, gestured to a constable. "Go and check on Price. Make sure the document's still there." The young officer saluted and hurried off. Miss Marple resumed her thoughtful silence, her fingers lightly tapping against the arm of her chair. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Cray sighed and checked his watch. "What's taking so long?" As if on cue, hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor. The constable reappeared, breathless and pale. "It's gone," he blurted. "The document, it's missing." Cray shot up from his chair. "What do you mean, missing?" "I mean it's not in Price's office. He swears he left it in his desk, but when he went to retrieve it, it was gone." A silence fell. Miss Marple sighed, a touch of disappointment in her voice. "Oh dear." Cray grabbed his coat. "We're going to that office now." They arrived at Leonard Price's office to find the solicitor pacing, visibly shaken. "I don't understand it," he insisted, wringing his hands. "I placed it right here, in this drawer." He yanked open the drawer, revealing its now empty interior. "I locked it, I swear I did," Cray scowled. "Then either you left it unlocked or someone has a key." Miss Marple's gaze drifted across the room, observing the disorder. Papers scattered on the desk, an upturned inkwell staining the IU corner of a legal ledger. It had the appearance of a hurried search rather than a careful burglary. "How many people have access to your office, Mr. Price?" she asked gently. Price shook his head, his face pale. "Only myself and my assistant, Miss Henderson, but she left hours ago." Cray exhaled sharply. "And you're certain the document was here earlier?" "Yes. I checked on it not long before I was called to the station." Miss Marple's brows knitted together. "Then it was taken recently." Cray turned to his constable. "Check the back entrance. See if there are any signs of forced entry." The officer hurried off, while Cray pinched the bridge of his nose. "Damn it, someone knew we were closing in, and they've just erased the one thing tying this back to the past." Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "Not erased, Inspector, merely hidden. You see, it is far easier to remove an object than to remove the truth." Price sank into his chair, his hands trembling slightly. "What do we do now?" Cray paced the office, his frustration evident. "Who benefits from this? Fanshawe is in custody. He couldn't have done it." Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. "No. But perhaps he was never the only one involved." Cray stilled. "You think there's someone else?" Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. "Inspector, haven't you wondered why Fanshawe was so clumsy? Why, despite his military training, he made such a crucial mistake with the brandy glass?" Cray frowned. "You mean—" Miss Marple nodded. "I believe he was meant to take the fall." A fresh silence settled over the room as the weight of her words sank in. Cray's mind worked furiously. "But then who—" A sharp rap at the door interrupted him. The constable had returned, his expression grim. "No sign of forced entry, sir." Cray cursed under his breath. "Then someone had a key." Miss Marple looked to Price. "Mr. Price, your assistant, Miss Henderson, does she have any unusual connections to this case?" Price hesitated. "Not that I—" He stopped suddenly, his eyes widening. "Wait, there was something odd earlier this week. She received a visitor, a gentleman rather distinguished looking, though I didn't catch his name." Cray straightened. "Describe him." Price furrowed his brow. "Tall, well-dressed, carried himself with a sort of authority." He glanced at Miss Marple. "Come to think of it, not unlike Colonel Warburton." Miss Marple's expression sharpened. That does sound rather familiar. Cray grabbed his coat. We need to find Miss Henderson. Now. The constable hesitated. Sir. She hasn't been seen since this afternoon. Another silence, heavier this time. Miss Marple let out a small sigh. How very inconvenient. I do believe we are now dealing with a vanishing secretary. And quite possibly, the true orchestrator of this crime. Cray clenched his fists. We need to track her down. If she has the document, we still have a chance. Miss Marple nodded, her expression calm but resolute. Yes, Inspector. And I rather think we should act quickly. Because if she is indeed the mastermind, she won't be content with simply running. She will do whatever it takes to ensure this secret stays buried for good. The night air had turned frigid, carrying a sharp wind that whispered through the hedgerows and narrow lanes of St. Mary Mead. Inside the station, tension coiled tightly around the room as Inspector Cray barked orders to his constables. Every available officer was to be put on the search for Miss Henderson, her home, her known acquaintances, anywhere she might have fled. Miss Marple remained seated near Cray's desk, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Though her outward demeanor was calm, her mind worked swiftly, rearranging the puzzle pieces now thrown into disarray. The stolen tribunal document had been a calculated move, a desperate one. Whoever had taken it knew that the walls were closing in. And now, Miss Henderson was gone. Cray paced, his brow furrowed. This doesn't make sense. Why wait until now to act? If she was working with Fanshawe, why not destroy the evidence earlier, Miss? Marple's voice was soft but firm. Because, Inspector, she needed the document as leverage. I suspect she never intended to be caught in the first place. A constable hurried in, breathless. Sir, we've checked Miss Henderson's home. There's no sign of her. But there's something else. He hesitated. Her door was open when we arrived. It looks like the place was searched. Cray stilled. Searched? Yes, sir. Drawers pulled out, papers scattered. But no sign of forced entry. A cold prickle ran down Miss Marple's spine. Oh dear. Cray exhaled sharply. That means one of two things. Either she left in a hurry and someone went after her, or she never left of her own accord at all. Miss Marple met his gaze. I fear it may be the latter. Cray grabbed his coat. Let's move. They arrived at Miss Henderson's cottage, a small but tidy home on the edge of the village. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking as the wind nudged it open. Inside, the signs of disturbance were unmistakable. Papers strewn across the floor, an overturned lamp, a teacup shattered against the hearth. But it was the silence that unsettled them most. Cray scanned the room. Searched the house, top to bottom. The constables moved swiftly, checking every room. It didn't take long before one of them called out from the bedroom. Sir, you need to see this. Miss Marple followed Cray down the narrow hallway, her heartbeat quickening. The bedroom was neat except for the wardrobe, its doors left slightly ajar. And inside, nestled between rows of hanging dresses, lay a body, Miss Henderson. Her eyes were wide and unseeing, her lips slightly parted as if frozen mid-gasp. A thin red line circled her throat where a silk scarf had been wound too tightly, cutting off her breath. There were no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no displaced furniture. Cray muttered a curse under his breath. Strangled, clean. No noise, no sign of a fight. He turned to Miss Marple. This wasn't done in a rush. Someone took their time. Miss Marple nodded grimly. Yes. and someone wanted to ensure she would never speak again. The weight of that realization settled over the room. Cray turned to his constables. "Check every inch of this place. If the tribunal document is here, I want it found." As they searched, Miss Marple moved carefully around the bedroom, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. It was then she noticed something curious. On the bedside table, next to a closed book, lay a single key. A simple, unassuming brass key. But something about it struck her as odd. She picked it up delicately, turning it over in her fingers. "Inspector, I believe this may be of interest." Cray took the key, frowning. "Doesn't look like it belongs to this house." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the open wardrobe. "No. And yet it was left here deliberately, almost as if it was meant to be found." Cray exhaled sharply. "So now we have a stolen document, a missing key, and a second murder. Our killer is still ahead of us." Miss Marple's voice was quiet but certain. "Not for long, Inspector. Not for long." Miss Marple studied the brass key in her hand, its surface smooth with use, but unmarked by any engravings or numbers. It was a curious thing, not belonging to Miss Henderson's house, and yet deliberately placed on her bedside table, as if it were meant to be discovered. There was an intention behind it, a message hidden in plain sight. Inspector Cray turned it over in his fingers, his frown deepening. No markings, no tags. Could be for anything. A drawer, a locker, a safety deposit box. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with quiet understanding. Or something far more personal. Cray looked at her sharply. "You've thought of something?" "I believe," she said thoughtfully, "that this key does not belong to Miss Henderson at all. It was left for us to find, yes, but not by her. By the killer." Cray exhaled. "Then why leave evidence behind?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the wardrobe, the silk scarves neatly arranged on their rail. "Because it isn't evidence, it's misdirection." The constables continued their search, rifling through the room for any sign of the missing tribunal document, but it was clear that it was long gone. Whoever had killed Miss Henderson had not done so in desperation. They had planned this. They had taken the document, left a clue behind, and vanished into the night. But a pattern was beginning to emerge, one of precise calculation rather than reckless violence. Miss Marple turned her attention back to the key. "This was placed here for a reason, and I dare say it means something only to those who truly understand the nature of this crime." Cray rubbed his chin. "You're saying the answer has been in front of us all along?" Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, Inspector. The question now is, what does this key unlock?" The answer came to her in a flash, something so simple, so obvious, that she almost smiled at the brilliance of it. Not a locker, not a drawer, not a safety deposit box. Something more intimate. She turned to Cray. "Inspector, do you recall Miss Henderson's handbag?" Cray blinked. "What about it?" "It was missing, was it not?" His eyes narrowed. "You think this key belongs to it?" Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely. And if I am not mistaken, Miss Henderson's bag will tell us exactly what she was planning to do before she was silenced." The urgency of the moment propelled them forward, retracing their steps through the house. The constables now searching not for stolen papers, but for a missing handbag. It was eventually found, tucked behind the sofa, as if someone had attempted to hide it in haste. Cray brought it to the table, opening the clasp with the key. Inside, among the usual contents, lipstick, handkerchiefs, a small compact, was a folded piece of paper. Cray unfolded it, his expression hardening as he read the hurried script. "Miss..." Marple leaned in. "What does it say?" Cray's jaw tightened. "It's a note addressed to someone. Looks like she was planning to meet with someone the night she died." He turned the paper toward her. The message was brief, but damning. "Meet me at the chapel at midnight. I have the document. We can put an end to this once and for all. Missy." Marple read the words carefully. The chapel, a secluded place away from prying eyes. Miss Henderson had arranged a meeting, but with whom? Cray exhaled. If she had the document, then the person she was meeting had to be the last one to see her alive. Either they stole it and killed her, or she never made it to the meeting at all. Miss Marple's gaze drifted past him, her mind connecting the pieces. "The chapel," she murmured. And then, as if struck by lightning, the full picture became clear. She straightened. "Inspector, I believe we have been looking at this all wrong. The pattern isn't in the deaths or even in the stolen document. It's in the meetings. Everyone involved in this case has been drawn to a specific place at a specific time." Cray frowned. "Go on." Miss Marple clasped her hands. Together, Miss Henderson arranged a meeting, believing she would be safe because she held the document as leverage. Before that, Fanshawe was killed while arranging his own meeting at the tribunal office. Each time someone was lured out alone, someone is orchestrating this, drawing people into isolated places under the pretense of negotiation, and then eliminating them. Cray's face darkened as realization dawned. "And the next target?" Miss Marple's voice was steady. "Whoever was meant to receive that letter." They exchanged a look of mutual understanding. The killer was still out there, setting another trap. And if they didn't act quickly, another victim would soon fall into it. Miss Marple sat in Inspector Cray's office, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Though her mind was anything but still, the pattern had become clear. Each victim had been drawn out under the pretense of a meeting, believing they held power over the situation, only to be silenced before they could act. The stolen tribunal document had been a piece of leverage, yes, but it was not the heart of the crime. There was something else, something much deeper. Cray paced before her, the letter from Miss Henderson still in his hand. The chapel at midnight. If we assume she was telling the truth in this note, then whoever she was meeting has the document now. And if that person is the killer, Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Inspector, let us not assume too much. Miss Henderson was indeed silenced before she could meet her contact. That much is clear, but I do not believe she was carrying the document at the time." Cray stopped. "You think she hid it?" Miss Marple nodded. "It is the only possibility. If she was clever enough to use it as leverage, then she would not have taken it with her to the meeting. She would have left it somewhere safe, just in case. And that means whoever killed her still does not have it." Cray's face hardened. "And they're going to keep killing until they find it." A knock at the door interrupted them. A constable entered, looking uneasy. "Sir, we've searched Miss Henderson's house top to bottom. No sign of the document." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then, Inspector, we must think like Miss Henderson. Where would she hide something of great importance? Not in her home, not in her office, but somewhere only she would think to look." Cray sighed. "You have an idea, don't you?" Miss Marple's expression grew pensive. "Yes, I do. And if I'm right, we will soon have our answer." They arrived at St. Mary Mead's chapel just before dusk. A modest stone structure stood silent under the darkening sky, its graveyard casting long shadows in the fading light. The air was damp with the promise of rain, and the scent of moss clung to the old stone walls. Miss Marple moved with purpose toward the back of the chapel, where the small vestry lay. She had observed Miss Henderson's habits over the years, her attendance at evening services, her role in organizing parish records. If she had needed a safe place to hide something, she would have chosen somewhere familiar, yet inconspicuous. She reached for the small wooden donation box mounted near the vestry door. It was unassuming, often overlooked. With careful fingers, she lifted the lid. Inside, beneath a layer of small coins, was a folded document. Cray let out a breath. She really did hide it. He reached inside, retrieving the paper, his eyes scanning the text. This is it, the tribunal report, the one that started all of this. Miss Marple did not look at the document, nor did she exhale in relief. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the chapel doors. Inspector, we are being watched. Cray stiffened. He followed her gaze, his hand instinctively moving toward his revolver. At the far end of the chapel grounds, just beyond the iron gate, stood a solitary figure. The moment they realized they had been spotted, they turned and fled into the night. Cray cursed. After them. The chase was swift but decisive. The figure had miscalculated, underestimating the number of officers stationed nearby. Within moments, the constables had cut off their escape, dragging them toward the light of the chapel's entrance. Miss Marple stepped forward, her gaze settling on the captive's face. There was no surprise in her eyes. It was Mr. Alderton, the tribunal's legal secretary. Cray's expression darkened. So it was you. Alderton's face was pale, his eyes darting wildly between them. I don't know what you mean. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost kind. Mr. Alderton, this was never about money or simple ambition, was it? His lips parted, but he said nothing. Miss Marple continued. At first it seemed a straightforward case, stolen legal documents, silenced witnesses, but there was something peculiar about the way the victims were chosen. Each one had a role in the tribunal, yes, but more than that, they all had something in common. They were each, in some way, connected to a particular case. Alderton's breathing quickened. Miss Marple turned to Cray. Inspector, do you recall the case of Henry Baxter? Cray's brow furrowed. Of course. A fraud case from years ago. Baxter was accused of embezzling funds, but the case was thrown out due to lack of evidence. Rumors spread that witnesses had been threatened into silence, but nothing was ever proven. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. And one of the junior clerks who handled those documents at the time was Mr. Alderton. Alderton's face twisted. That case was a travesty. Miss Marple's voice remained steady. Indeed, but not in the way you believe, I suspect. I think you knew the truth all along. Perhaps you had proof. Proof that Baxter was guilty, proof that could have brought him to justice. But you were powerless then, weren't you? Alderton's hands clenched into fists. The system failed. He whispered. Baxter walked free. He lived in comfort, while the people he ruined were left with nothing. Miss Marple sighed. And so, years later, when the tribunal was formed, you saw an opportunity, a chance to correct the wrongs of the past. Cray's face darkened. You killed them because they were involved in the Baxter case. Alderton let out a bitter laugh. I killed them because they were corrupt, because they were part of the system that let a guilty man go free. Fanshawe knew. I saw it in his eyes. Henderson too. They had a chance to make things right, and they didn't. So I did what they wouldn't. I ensured that no one like Baxter would ever slip through again. Miss Marple shook her head sadly. But in doing so, you became the very thing you despised. You murdered innocent people, Mr. Alderton. You did not deliver justice. You delivered revenge. Alderton's breath came in short gasps, as though the weight of his actions had only just settled upon him. The constables held him firm, awaiting Cray's order. Cray's voice was cold. You're under arrest, Alderton, for multiple counts of murder. As the constables led him away, Miss Marple remained still, watching the shadows shift in the candlelight of the chapel. Cray turned to her. I don't understand one thing. If he was so meticulous, why leave the key behind? Miss Marple's smile was faint. Because deep down, he wanted to be caught. He had convinced himself that he was acting for justice, but a part of him knew the truth. And so he left a door open, however small, for someone to stop him before he went too far. Cray exhaled, running a hand through his hair. And to think it all started with a single missing document. Miss Marple turned toward the chapel door, the night air cool against her skin. No, Inspector, she said quietly. It started, long before that, with a man who believed he could rewrite justice to suit his own desires. And with that, the mystery was solved. Inspector Cray stood in the dimly lit hallway of the police station, watching as the constables led Alderton to his holding cell. The man's shoulders sagged, his earlier defiance drained away. But something still gnawed at Cray. It had been too easy, too neat. Alderton had crumbled under the weight of his own actions, but had he truly been working alone? Miss Marple, standing beside him, seemed to sense his unease. You are troubled, Inspector. Cray exhaled, his fingers drumming against the railing. It doesn't sit right with me, Miss Marple. If Alderton was acting alone, why did he panic when he saw us at the chapel? He hadn't been officially suspected yet. And if he truly believed in his cause, why didn't he try to destroy the document rather than retrieve it? Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. Perhaps because he was not acting solely for himself. Cray frowned. You think there's someone else? Miss Marple nodded. I do, and I believe that person is still at large. The realization sent a fresh wave of urgency through Cray. If Alderton had a partner, or worse, a manipulator, then they had not yet stopped the true architect of these crimes. He turned sharply. I want every record Alderton worked on these past months, every tribunal decision, every legal case he handled. Someone was pushing him. The search was swift. Within an hour, they were combing through Alderton's papers, his notes filled with meticulous observations about the tribunal and the people involved. But one name kept appearing, subtly, almost as an afterthought, yet always present. Sir Geoffrey Lytton. Cray let out a slow breath. Sir Geoffrey was a senior member of the legal council, a man with an untarnished reputation, respected by both the courts and the political elite. Yet Alderton had noted meetings with him, cryptic references to discussions that did not appear in official logs. Miss Marple, reading over his shoulder, tapped a slender finger against one of the notes. A guiding hand, she murmured. How very interesting. Cray's stomach tightened. If Sir Geoffrey was manipulating Alderton, then we've just put his scapegoat behind bars while he remains free. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Then perhaps it is time we set a little trap, Inspector. The invitation was sent the next morning. An official request from Inspector Cray for Sir Geoffrey Lytton to assist in reviewing certain tribunal records. It was a clever ruse. A man of his standing would never refuse to demonstrate his commitment to justice. And so, just past noon, Sir Geoffrey arrived at the station, his silver hair neatly combed, his expression one of polite concern. "Inspector, I must say I was surprised to receive your request," he said, as he settled into a chair across from Cray. "I do hope this is not an indication of some bureaucratic misstep on my part." Cray leaned back, his gaze cool. "Not at all, Sir Geoffrey. In fact, your insight may prove invaluable." Sir Geoffrey nodded graciously. "Then how may I assist you?" Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner, chose that moment to speak. "It is quite a tragic thing," she said, her voice soft, "when a man is driven to commit terrible crimes in the name of justice." Sir Geoffrey turned his gaze toward her, polite curiosity masking the flicker of something else, wariness. "Indeed, a tragedy," he said smoothly. Miss Marple smiled. "You knew Henry Baxter, did you not?" The shift was almost imperceptible, but she caught it. The tightening of his fingers against the armrest, the slight tilt of his head. "I was acquainted with him, yes. His case was most unfortunate." "And yet," Miss Marple continued, "Alderton believed justice had not been served. So much so that he resorted to murder. One wonders where he got such an idea." Sir Geoffrey's expression did not waver. "You seem to be implying something, madam." Cray pushed a document toward him. "This is a transcript of Alderton's private notes. He mentioned you frequently. Meetings, advice, a guiding hand." Sir Geoffrey's lips pressed into a thin line. "It is not uncommon for junior legal officers to seek guidance from their seniors." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. And yet, Inspector Cray and I have been reviewing tribunal records. Alderton was not the only one who believed Henry Baxter should have been punished." Sir Geoffrey said nothing. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but relentless. "You despised Baxter, did you not? You believed his acquittal was a disgrace. And yet you, a man of the law, could not take direct action. But Alderton, passionate, impressionable Alderton, he could be guided, could he not?" Sir Geoffrey's nostrils flared, but his voice remained calm. "This is absurd. The rantings of a criminal do not implicate me." Cray tilted his head. "Perhaps. But what if I told you we found something quite interesting at Alderton's home? A letter, signed by you." Sir Geoffrey's breath hitched. Cray let the silence stretch before pressing forward. "A letter, Sir Geoffrey, in which you encouraged Alderton to act when the law failed, to do what needed to be done." Sir Geoffrey inhaled sharply, his composure fracturing. "You have no such letter." Miss Marple's smile was almost kind. "Oh, but we do." The room was utterly still. Then, ever so slightly, Sir Geoffrey slumped back in his chair. His hands trembled just once before he steadied them. "That fool," he muttered. "I told him to be discreet, but he was always too eager." Cray leaned forward. "So you admit it?" Sir Geoffrey's expression was unreadable. "I guided him. Yes, I showed him what the law had failed to do. But I never told him to kill." Miss Marple sighed. "No, of course not. You simply pointed him toward those who had wronged justice. You let him believe he was acting on his own." Sir Geoffrey let out a bitter laugh. "And you think that makes me guilty?" Cray stood. "Yes, I do, and so will a jury." The constables moved in, taking Sir Geoffrey by the arms. He did not resist, only smiled faintly. "You cannot imprison an idea." "Inspector," he murmured. "What I've started—" Cray cut him off. "What you've started is over." As Sir Geoffrey was led away, Miss Marple exhaled softly. "Such a waste," she murmured. "Brilliant minds, lost to arrogance and vengeance." Cray gave her a wry look. "And you knew all along, didn't you?" Miss Marple smiled. "Not all along, Inspector. Only since the moment I realized Alderton was a man who thought himself righteous. And righteousness, untempered by wisdom, is always the most dangerous thing of all." And with that, the case was truly closed. As the heavy doors of Scotland Yard closed behind Sir Geoffrey Lytton, Inspector Cray exhaled, rubbing his temples. The case had been airtight. Sir Geoffrey had as much as confessed, even if he had couched it in philosophical musings. Yet an uneasy feeling lingered. He glanced at Miss Marple, who stood by the window, watching the rain drizzle down the glass. "You don't look satisfied," he remarked. Miss Marple turned, her face thoughtful. "Oh, it is not dissatisfaction, Inspector. More unease. Have you ever sewn a tapestry?" Cray blinked. "No, I can't say I have." "Ah," she said with a small smile. "Well, in a tapestry, every thread connects seamlessly. But sometimes if you turn it over, you'll find a loose thread barely visible. But when pulled, why, the whole thing unravels." Cray frowned. "You think something's wrong?" Miss Marple hesitated. "Not wrong, precisely, but unfinished." The word sent a ripple of doubt through him. He turned back to his desk, staring at the case file. They had their culprit, his confession. The case was done. And yet— A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. A constable entered, his face pale. "Sir, there's been a development. A letter found in Alderton's personal effects. One that doesn't match Sir Geoffrey's correspondence." Cray's pulse quickened. "A letter? From whom?" The constable hesitated. "We don't know, sir. It was unsigned, but you need to see it for yourself." Cray took the envelope, his fingers tense as he pulled out the neatly folded paper. The handwriting was small, careful, deliberate. Justice must not be left in the hands of men. Sometimes the scales must be tipped by those who understand the true weight of a crime. You know what must be done. Be swift. Be decisive. Let not the guilty escape. There was no name, no direct instruction, just a whisper in the dark, nudging Alderton toward the abyss. Miss Marple peered over his shoulder, reading silently. Then she murmured, "This is not Sir Geoffrey's style." Cray exhaled sharply. "No, it isn't." The words were too precise. Sir Geoffrey had manipulated Alderton, yes, but he had been an orator, a man who prided himself on legal argument. This was something else, a directive, a push from the shadows. Miss Marple sat calmly by the fireplace, her fingers lightly resting on her lap, but her sharp blue eyes gleamed with the clarity of someone who had seen the final piece of a puzzle slip into place. She had been turning the problem over in her mind, unraveling the pattern of events like a skilled seamstress undoing a tangled thread. "Inspector," she said gently, May I see the letter again? Cray handed it to her. She studied the paper, running a gloved finger over the ink as if searching for an invisible fingerprint. "It is not merely the words that interest me," she murmured. "It is the way they are written." Cray frowned. "Go on." Miss Marple held up the note. "You see, dear Inspector, handwriting is a most revealing thing. This is not the shaky scrawl of an elderly barrister nor the rushed script of a desperate man. It is careful, measured, controlled." The pen did not waver, nor did the writer hesitate. This was not the work of a man who feared the consequences. Cray's mind churned. You think the real mastermind had no doubt about Alderton following orders. Indeed, and that suggests two things. She raised a delicate finger. First, that the person knew Alderton well enough to anticipate his reactions. Another finger joined the first. Second, that they felt themselves entirely beyond suspicion. A person who directs others to commit murder, yet remains unseen, is often someone who does not fear scrutiny. Cray leaned forward. "Then we're looking for someone in a position of trust, someone close to Alderton." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Precisely, Inspector." There was a long silence. Then Cray cursed under his breath. "Lady Marchwood." Miss Marple gave a small smile, pleased by his reasoning. She was the one who encouraged Alderton to fight the charges against her nephew, Cray went on, piecing it together. She provided financial backing for his defense, and she was in the house that night, wasn't she? Miss Marple nodded. "Not only in the house, Inspector. She was also the last person to speak to Alderton before he left for Sir Geoffrey's estate." Cray exhaled sharply. "And she would have had access to his books if she planted the letter." Then, she had already decided Alderton would do exactly as instructed. Miss Marple finished. A fresh sense of urgency seized them both. Cray didn't waste another second. He grabbed his coat, signaling to the constable, "Get the car, now." The journey to Marchwood Hall was tense, the rhythmic pounding of rain against the windows mirroring the hurried tempo of Cray's thoughts. If Lady Marchwood truly was the orchestrator behind the crime, she was also the last loose end. And if she suspected they were closing in, there was no telling what she might do. When they arrived, the butler hesitated only briefly before admitting them. The grand hall was dimly lit, the flickering glow of the chandelier casting long, uncertain shadows across the polished floor. At the far end of the room, seated in an elegant armchair, as though she had been expecting them, was Lady Marchwood. She looked up from a book, her expression serene. "Inspector Cray, and dear Miss Marple. What a surprise." Cray strode forward. "No more games, Lady Marchwood. We know you wrote the letter. We know you pushed Alderton toward murder." A delicate smile played on her lips. "Do you? How clever." Cray slammed the letter onto the table before her. "This was found in Alderton's possession, tucked into Crime and Punishment. A book that you, by all accounts, gifted him just days before the murder." Lady Marchwood glanced at the note, then back at Cray. "And what does that prove, Inspector?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "It proves that you understood Alderton's weaknesses. You knew he sought justice for your nephew, and you planted the idea in his mind. You gave him a nudge, just enough to tip him over the edge." For the first time, a flicker of something passed through Lady Marchwood's expression, not fear, not panic, amusement. "And what if I did?" she said lightly, tilting her head. Will you arrest me for writing a letter, Inspector? For suggesting that a guilty man should not escape punishment? Cray clenched his fists. You manipulated a man into murder. Did I? She arched a delicate brow. Or did he act of his own accord? Silence stretched between them. Cray knew it wouldn't hold up in court. A letter with no signature, a carefully placed book, a suggestion whispered in the dark. Lady Marchwood had not held the weapon. She had not pulled the trigger. She had simply guided, and she knew it. Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. Tell me, Lady Marchwood, do you feel remorse? Lady Marchwood's lips curved into a soft smile. I feel satisfaction, Miss Marple, and that is quite a different thing. Cray exhaled heavily. He could feel the case slipping through his fingers. There would be no justice today, no trial, no arrest. Just the quiet certainty that a brilliant mind had orchestrated a perfect crime and had gotten away with it. Lady Marchwood rose gracefully, smoothing the folds of her dress. Now, if you'll excuse me, Inspector, I do believe I have entertained you long enough. Cray had never felt such frustration, but Miss Marple, ever composed, merely gave a small nod. One final thing, Lady Marchwood, she said. Do be careful. When one weaves such intricate webs, it is all too easy to become ensnared in them oneself. For the first time, Lady Marchwood hesitated, just for a second. Just long enough for Miss Marple to see that she had planted a seed of doubt. Then, with a smile as poised as ever, she turned and walked away. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving the world damp and cold. Cray clenched his fists. She'll never pay for it. Not in any way that matters. Miss Marple looked at him with a quiet knowing. Oh, but Inspector, she said softly. Justice takes many forms. The guilty always live with their crimes, even when no prison holds them. And with that, she turned, walking away into the mist, leaving behind only the certainty that, though the law had failed, the truth had been laid bare. The rain had stopped by the time Inspector Cray and Miss Marple stepped onto the damp cobblestone path leading away from Marchwood Hall. The night air was thick with the scent of wet earth. And somewhere, in the distance, an owl let out a solitary call. The world should have felt settled, the case closed, at least in the eyes of the law. And yet, as Cray walked, the weight of unfinished business pressed upon him like a stone in his chest. Miss Marple, ever composed, clasped her hands lightly in front of her, her delicate steps steady on the uneven path. You seem troubled, Inspector, she observed softly. Cray let out a slow breath, his jaw tightening. Because I am. She got away with it, Miss Marple. We know she did it. Lady Marchwood as good as admitted it. And yet she'll go on with her life as if nothing happened. Miss Marple tilted her head, considering. Ah, but you see, dear Inspector, getting away with something and truly escaping its consequences are not the same thing. A person may walk free, but the weight of their actions never truly leaves them. Cray shook his head. That's cold comfort. She played us, manipulated Alderton into killing Lytton, then stood there with that serene little smile, daring us to prove it. Miss Marple sighed, gazing up at the grand silhouette of Marchwood Hall against the cloudy sky. Yes, she was quite masterful, but something still troubles me. Cray glanced at her. What is it? Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against the folds of her coat. "The letter, Inspector. The one we found tucked inside Crime and Punishment." Cray frowned. "What about it?" "The timing," Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful. "It was placed in the book before Alderton took action. A clever way to ensure he followed through. But consider this. Why leave such an incriminating piece of evidence where it might later be discovered?" Cray exhaled sharply. "Because she's arrogant. She never thought anyone would find it." "Perhaps," Miss Marple mused. "Or perhaps it was placed there after the fact, when someone wanted us to believe Alderton had been manipulated." Cray stopped, walking. "You think the letter was planted after the murder?" Miss Marple turned to face him fully, her expression serene but her eyes alight with curiosity. "It is possible, is it not? The handwriting was careful, too careful. A letter written in true desperation often contains hesitations, smudges, the weight of the moment imprinted upon the ink. But this, it was almost too perfect." Cray's mind whirred. If she was right, then they had been led to a conclusion, one that was meant to appear obvious. Then that means... He trailed off, his mind racing. "Someone else wanted us to suspect Lady Marchwood." Miss Marple nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Precisely, Inspector. And if that is the case, then we must ask ourselves, who benefits most from her being seen as the mastermind?" Cray's pulse quickened. There was someone else in the shadows. Miss Marple's gaze drifted back toward the grand house. "Or perhaps, Inspector, there is another game still in play." The realization settled in Cray's gut like a stone. The case wasn't over. It had never been over. They had been shown only what they were meant to see, and somewhere, hidden within, the details they had overlooked, the real answer lay waiting to be found. Miss Marple turned, her step light as she began to walk away once more. "I do believe, dear Inspector," she said over her shoulder, "that we have yet another mystery on our hands." Cray hesitated only a moment before following. The night stretched before them, filled with possibilities, and the unsettling certainty that the truth had yet to fully reveal itself.